The UN says the humanitarian situation in Ukraine is deteriorating at an alarming pace. According to the UN Refugee Agency, an estimated 1.9 million people have been displaced internally, and more than 2.5 million people have now crossed international borders out of the country.
We'll start off with Ukraine as usual, and another rather depressing update about the humanitarian situation, which continues to deteriorate at an alarming pace. Our humanitarian colleagues estimate that now 1.9 million people have been internally displaced, and more than 2.3 million have now crossed international borders out of Ukraine, and this is according to UNHCR. Three things are critical in the short term, as the Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths has stressed. Civilians, whether they stay or leave, must be respected and protected. Safe passage is needed for humanitarian supplies, and we need a system of constant communications with parties to the conflict. National Day of Women Judges, the day was created to reaffirm our... In terms of response, humanitarian organizations are deploying additional staff across the country and are working to move supplies to warehouses at different hubs within Ukraine and outside. So far, we, along with our partners, have reached more than 500,000 people with some form of humanitarian assistance in Ukraine, including life-saving food, shelter, blankets, and medical supplies. If humanitarian access is secured, we are set to reach much higher numbers given the scope and scale of the humanitarian operations being currently deployed.
Well, for more on these stories, let's bring in national security and foreign policy analyst Nola Haynes, who joins me live now from California. Hi, Nola. Thank you so much indeed for joining us. The UN has said figures we're hearing between 2.3 to 2.5 million refugees now have fled Ukraine. One of the biggest humanitarian crises that the West has seen in its history. I mean, is this becoming a potential threat to national security and to the security of the EU in general?
Refugee crises are always, I definitely wouldn't frame it in terms of it being a threat. What I will say is that it exacerbates existing security problems. So for instance, we are still in a global pandemic, although COVID-19 has receded in some parts of the world, other parts it hasn't. So in terms of all the movement, because of the refugee crisis, that's definitely something that we should keep our eyes on. And because, you know, all that movement, and we don't know what they're asking for at the border, if they're testing people, if they have the equipment to test people. So the COVID concern is definitely one thing that I would consider a threat. But in terms of refugees themselves seeking asylum, seeking safety, I wouldn't say that that's a threat to national security. What I would say is a threat to national security is the actual reason as to why they're fleeing.
Yeah, I mean, and the obviously now we're hearing about the subject of chemical weapons. We're seeing towns and cities in Ukraine that were relatively seen as safe being hit by Russian shelling over the last couple of days. I mean, basically, how big of the risk now that the problem of chemical weapons being brought up? Both sides have accused each other of stockpiling them, but we know that Russia have used them before, and obviously a staunch ally of Russia, the Syrian government, have certainly used it on their own people. I mean, this is clearly a huge risk, and can anything be prepared to try and prevent the worst case scenario should they be used?
That's a very good question. You know, President Zelensky gave a very impassioned speech letting the world know that they do not make chemical weapons. They just do regular, you know, scientific things in their factories. So he was definitely making a plea for the world to understand that this is another, you know, obfuscation, intentional disinformation, you know, on the part of Russia. He wanted to make very clear that they do not have that weapons technology and capability. But like you said, Russia has used chemical weapons before, and we need to take Putin's securitizing language very seriously. You know, many people were shocked that he invaded Ukraine to begin with, and he did. So the same way he's made threats, nuclear threats, the same way, they're making these kind of veiled chemical weapon threats while already conditioning people to blame, Ukraine. This is the Russian playbook. And there's evidence that they've done this before in Syria. They've used chemical weapons before. So I absolutely believe that is definitely something on the table, and they will absolutely blame Ukraine.
And we're still hearing some Western countries, but more so organizations like the UN. And we've even heard China, and they're still talking about diplomacy, and this has to be dealt with diplomatically. I mean, is it too late for that? Because we're dealing with, or the West are dealing with an opponent that clearly doesn't believe in diplomacy because, well, the troops are marching in and have already caused thousands of deaths.
Yeah, so diplomacy, I'm always diplomacy first. I do not think that diplomacy will not work. What I do think is that Putin had a point to make. And this is what we're seeing right now. We are seeing Putin say, I made these threats, I kept my promise. So when I make a threat, it is a credible threat. But in terms of him getting out of this situation, and with Russia being able to recoup some semblance of its economy, some semblance of its reputation, there's going to be a diplomatic solution at the end of it. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like. Everyone may not get what they want. There are tons of people who want Vladimir Putin dragged into The Hague, and that may or may not happen. But as I see it, the only out is some level of a diplomatic solution.
And you mentioned the Hague and many people, I think even the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson was saying he should be tried for war crimes. Clearly he has no respect, almost doesn't recognise the Hague. So we're seeing countries have votes on such proposals, but surely they don't mean anything, and maybe is it something that should be sorted out at a later stage as opposed to sorting out the refugee crisis that's on Europe's door?
I absolutely think the refugee crisis is definitely something that everyone should be focused on. Everyone should collaboratively figure out around the world. In terms of holding Vladimir Putin accountable, to your point, it's definitely not an easy solution. It's not just a situation where you can go knock on his door and arrest him and take him off to the ICC. It's not that simple. And like you mentioned, Vladimir Putin doesn't recognize the court. So those types of legal limitations kind of prevent an expedient accountability that a lot of people want to see, right? So that's one bucket that, in my personal opinion, I'm not necessarily spending a whole lot of time thinking about, but I absolutely do understand people wanting Vladimir Putin to be held accountable. I do think that the energy and resources should be put on the refugee crisis. That's definitely going to be a crisis around the world. And I also think that in terms of getting people out of Ukraine needs to also be where the focus is, because I know that the ceasefires, they last for 5 minutes and then there's another conversation. So getting people out, keeping civilians safe, keeping women and children safe, that should absolutely be a priority. Keeping disabled people safe, keeping elderly people safe, that should be a priority.
Well, Nola, we have to leave it there, but thank you ever so much for joining us here on Arise America.